One of the biggest e-bike brands in North America just collapsed, and it's connected to a wave of battery fires nobody's talking about. Now riders are asking if Bosch, Shimano, and Bafang could be next, since they basically control the entire motor industry. The truth behind this recall panic is stranger than anyone expected, and it's already changing what you can legally buy. To understand why this recall wave hit now, you have to understand how fast this industry grew. E-bikes were a niche product a decade ago, the kind of thing you saw on one neighbor's garage wall. They are not niche anymore. Industry analysts tracking customs import data estimate that roughly 1.7 million e-bikes entered the United States in 2024 alone, a 72% jump from the 990 Susan units imported the year before, arriving from more than 800 factories scattered across China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and beyond. By 2025, market researchers put annual US e-bike sales at around 1.5 million units a year, feeding a domestic market now valued north of $1 billion. With the $1,500 to $499 price bracket alone accounting for close to 30% of every bike sold. Almost all of those bikes run on lithium-ion batteries, which now account for roughly 78% of the US e-bike battery market. Lithium-ion is genuinely a great technology. It is light, it holds a huge amount of energy for its size, and it charges fast, which is exactly why it ended up in your phone, your laptop, and now the frame of your bike, or tucked inside your bike's down tube. But that same energy density is the reason a damaged or poorly made lithium-ion cell can enter something called thermal runaway, an uncontrolled chain reaction inside the battery that produces intense heat, toxic gas, and in the worst cases, fire that conventional extinguishers struggle to put out. For most of the last decade, the US had almost no dedicated safety standard, forcing manufacturers to prove their batteries could not do this. So as millions of new e-bikes flooded in from hundreds of unfamiliar overseas factories, many of them run by companies that had never built a battery pack before, the safety net simply was not there yet. It helps to understand what is actually happening inside a failing pack, because the phrase battery fire covers a lot of very different situations. A genuine e-bike battery is not one big cell. It is dozens of individual lithium-ion cells wired together and wrapped around a small circuit board called a battery management system, or BMS, whose entire job is to watch every cell's voltage and temperature and shut the whole pack down before anything goes wrong. On a certified battery, that BMS is tested to catch overcharging, short circuits, and physical damage from a drop or a crash. On a cheap or counterfeit pack, that chip is often the first component cut to save a few dollars, or it uses recycled and mismatched cells graded for a lower capacity than advertised, forced to work harder than they were built for. Once one of those weaker cells starts to overheat, the heat spreads to its neighbors in a chain reaction, and without a functioning BMS to interrupt it, that chain reaction becomes thermal runaway within seconds. That gap, a real safety chip on one side and a corner cut for margin on the other, is the actual dividing line running through almost every incident in this story, far more than any single brand name. That gap is where most of the real fires started. Late in 2025, the CPSC and the direct-to-consumer brand VIVI recalled roughly 24,000 e-bikes across 15 different models, all built around the same 36-volt lithium-ion batteries sold through Amazon and Walmart listings. VIVI told regulators it was aware of 14 cases where the batteries overheated, including 3 actual fires, though no injuries were reported. Around the same time, Rad Power bikes, one of the best-known e-bike brands in North America, found itself at the center of a much messier story. In November 2025, the CPSC issued a public safety warning, not a formal recall, telling owners to immediately stop using specific Rad Power battery models, the RP1304, the Rad S1304Y, and the HLRP S1304. The agency said it had received 31 reports of fire and about $734,500 in property damage, and pointed out that some of those fires started while the batteries were not even charging or in use, sitting quietly in a garage or a storage closet. The warning became a warning instead of a recall because Rad Power refused to agree to the CPSC's terms, arguing a full recall would bankrupt the company. That was not an exaggeration. Weeks later, Rad Power told the state of Washington it might have to cease operations as early as January 2026 without new funding, and by late December, the company had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, throwing warranty coverage for hundreds of thousands of existing customers into question. Then, in March 2026, the CPSC issued another emergency warning, this time for Ridstar Q20 and Q20 Pro e-bikes, citing 11 reports of fire, including 1 burn injury, 5 reports of smoke inhalation, and 2 incidents causing more than $40,000 in property damage. Add in earlier CPSC warnings around aftermarket unit pack power batteries, and a broader pattern comes into focus. Researchers who track the CPSC's full recall database count 32 separate e-bike recalls in the United States since the very first one back in March 2014, covering roughly 234,000 units combined. About a quarter of those recalls, covering an estimated 65,000 units, were tied specifically to fire hazards rather than mechanical defects like brakes or wheels. Nearly every one of those fire-related incidents traces back to budget, direct-to-consumer, or aftermarket batteries, mostly sold online, mostly built to hit a price point rather than a safety standard. So where do Bosch, Shimano, and Bafang actually fit into this story? Because those are the three names that made the title of this video. Here is the honest answer. None of the three has had a US battery recall on the scale of VIVI, Rad Power, or Ridstar, but each of them touches this story in a very specific way, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Start with Shimano. In November 2024, the German e-bike brand Canyon recalled its Spectral-on and Torque-on electric mountain bikes after discovering that the Shimano-supplied battery packs inside them could develop cracks in their casing, letting in water and debris. Canyon paused sales of both models entirely. It took over a year of redesign work before the bikes returned to market with a new battery built from a single aluminum shell, sealed to an IP57 waterproof rating, running slightly larger 5.6 amp-hour cells instead of the original 5.0, and weighing 150 grams less than the recalled 900 watt-hour pack. That is a real, verifiable recall tied to a Shimano battery, and it is a good example of how even a premium supplier can ship a flawed design. It is also a good example of what a responsible recall looks like. Caught before mass casualties, fixed with an engineering redesign, and returned to shelves with fresh third-party certification to prove it. Bosch has a different story entirely. Rather than being caught in a recall, Bosch has spent years publicly pushing regulators to go further. Back in 2022, Claudia Wasco, who runs Bosch e-bike systems in North America, told trade press that the CPSC should mandate testing for the entire e-bike electrical system, not just the battery pack, pointing to a standard called UL 2849 as the model to follow. That standard requires overcharge tests, short-circuit tests, mechanical abuse and crush tests, and quarterly unannounced inspections of the factory floor by an independent lab. Her argument was that a battery can pass every one of those tests in isolation and still be dangerous once it is wired into a cheap controller or paired with a mismatched charger. That is exactly the kind of system-level failure investigators later found behind several of the budget bike incidents. Then there is Bafang, which is a slightly different kind of exposure. Bafang does not really sell finished e-bikes under its own name in the US. Instead, its motors, controllers, and battery packs show up as components inside an enormous range of other brands, including the same Rad Power bikes caught up in that 2025 CPSC warning. Bafang hardware is also the single most common choice for do-it-yourself electric bike conversion kits sold through online marketplaces, and multiple safety agencies, including the UK's Office for Product Safety and Standards, have found that aftermarket and post-market conversions account for something close to 45 to 46% of all e-bike related fires they tracked. So Bafang itself is not being recalled. But under the new certification rules spreading across the country, a motor, battery, and charger combination has to be tested and certified together as one complete system, which means thousands of Bafang-powered bike models, built around whatever battery happened to be cheapest, that year may no longer be legal to sell new unless somebody pays to recertify that exact combination. Which brings us to the actual mechanism behind that viral claim, and it has almost nothing to do with any single brand's batteries failing. It has everything to do with the law changing underneath the entire industry at once. California's SB 1271, signed in September 2024, took effect on January 1, 2026, and it requires every new e-bike battery, charger, and electrical system sold or leased in the state to be tested by an accredited lab and certified to UL 2849, UL 2271, or the European EN 15194 standard. Uncertified batteries, including most cheap aftermarket and DIY replacement packs, simply cannot legally be sold new in California anymore. A companion law, AB 544, also effective January 1, 2026, adds mandatory rear lighting visible from 500 feet and forces retailers to disclose a bike's classification, motor wattage, and certification status at the point of sale. Rental fleets get a longer runway, with full compliance required by January 1, 2028. New York City moved even earlier. A local law passed in 2023 requires every e-mobility device sold, leased, or distributed in the city to carry certification to UL 2849 for full systems, UL 2272 for personal devices, or UL2271 for standalone batteries, backed by real confiscation power on the street. Other states are catching up fast. New Jersey went furthest of all, treating e-bikes essentially like motor vehicles starting in July 2026, with full licensing and insurance requirements for riders. Enforcement everywhere has shifted from friendly warnings to real fines, with violations now running anywhere from $25 to $300 depending on the jurisdiction. At the federal level, a bipartisan bill called the Setting Consumer Standards for Lithium-Ion Batteries Act, filed in Congress as both S.389 and H.R. 973, would extend those same standards nationwide if it eventually passes. Put all of that together, and you get the real version of this video's title. It is true that a significant share of e-bike batteries on the market today, across dozens of brands, are technically ineligible to be sold new the moment these laws fully kick in, simply because they were never tested to the new combined standard. That includes some configurations built around Bafang motors and generic battery packs. It does not mean Bosch or Shimano or Bafang shipped a defective product into your garage. It means the rules changed, and every brand, premium and budget alike, now has to prove their systems meet them before another unit reaches a showroom floor. The market noticed before most riders did. Insurers writing home and renters policies increasingly ask whether a covered e-bike carries UL 2849 certification before approving a claim tied to fire damage, and several major carriers now treat the certification label the same way they treat a smoke detector, a factor that can lower a premium rather than just avoid a denial. Established manufacturers have leaned into that shift as a selling point rather than a burden, printing certification numbers directly onto product pages next to battery capacity and range, the same way a car listing now leads with crash test ratings. Brands that cannot afford the lab fees for full system certification, often the same direct-to-consumer names caught up in the 2025 and 2026 warnings, are the ones facing real pressure to either invest in testing or exit the American market entirely. Here is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the scary headlines. This crackdown is measurably working. New York City tracked 18 deaths from lithium-ion battery fires in 2023, the worst year on record, alongside 268 separate fires. The city passed its certification law that same year and paired it with aggressive enforcement, a $1 million public education campaign, and a battery trade-in program letting delivery workers swap an uncertified e-bike for a certified one. In 2024, even as the total number of fires ticked up slightly to 277, the death toll fell to 6, a 67% drop. The FDNY's dedicated lithium-ion battery task force inspected 585 e-bike shops that year, up 25% from 2023, issuing 426 summonses, 138 violation orders, and shutting down 7 locations entirely. Then in 2025, the number of deaths from lithium-ion battery fires in the entire city fell to 1. FDNY Commissioner Lillian Bonsignor confirmed it personally. That single death happened on the 4th of July, when a fire believed to have started in an e-mobility device outside a bathroom spread through a pizzeria in Queens, killing a 76-year-old woman inside. One death is still one death too many, and it is a reminder that the underlying risk has not disappeared just because the numbers improved. For comparison, London saw the opposite trend over the same stretch, with its fire brigade responding to 407 e-bike and e-scooter fires in 2024 alone, more than quadruple the count from 2020, in a city that still lacks anything close to New York's mandatory certification law. Going from 18 deaths to 1 in 2 years, in the same city, using the same rough mix of delivery riders and commuters, is about as close to a controlled experiment as public safety policy ever gets, and the London numbers are what the graph looks like without one. The batteries did not get safer because Bosch or Shimano panicked. They got safer because a testing standard that already existed, UL 2849, finally became mandatory instead of optional. So if you are shopping for an e-bike right now, or you already own one, and you are wondering if you should be worried, the real takeaway is not fear, it is specificity. If your bike came from an established brand with a US service network, Trek, Specialized, Cannondale, Giant, Aventon, or Electric, or one built around a name brand drive system from Bosch, Shimano, Yamaha, Bros, or Bafang paired with a certified battery from the same supplier, you are riding one of the safer configurations on the market right now. Look for the UL 2849 or UL 2271 label near the battery or charger port, verifiable through UL's own online database, and keep the original charger that came in the box rather than swapping in whatever is cheapest online. Charge on a hard, non-flammable surface like a garage floor rather than a carpet or a bed. Avoid charging directly next to your only exit, and unplug once the pack reaches full rather than leaving it on overnight out of habit. If your bike is a generic import, a DIY conversion kit, or came with a battery you are not entirely sure who manufactured, that is the profile these new laws are specifically targeting, and it is worth checking whether a certified replacement exists before your next long charge. Watch your existing battery for the same warning signs firefighters look for during an inspection: swelling or a puffed up case, a sweet or chemical smell, unusual heat during normal riding, a sudden drop of more than a third in your usual range, or any damage after a crash or a hard drop are all reasons to stop using that pack immediately and have it inspected rather than waiting to see if it gets worse. The freedom that got you into e-biking in the first place, the ability to cover 30 miles of trail before lunch or commute across a city without touching a gas pump, was never really the problem here. A handful of corner-cutting battery suppliers were, and for the first time since this industry exploded, the law is finally catching up to the technology instead of trailing years behind it. None of that means every certified battery is perfect forever, and none of it means you can ignore basic charging habits just because a label says UL 2849. What it does mean is that the ground under this entire industry has shifted in the last 2 years, quietly and mostly for the better, while the loudest headlines kept chasing the scariest version of the story instead of the true one. If you want to see exactly how these new battery standards get tested inside a real UL lab, the video linked on your screen right now walks through the entire certification process from the inside, cell by cell.